In the rolling hills of Albemarle County, Virginia, on a winter evening in 1819, Thomas Jefferson sat by candlelight in his study at Monticello. Before him lay ledger books, filled with meticulous calculations. But these weren't tallies of tobacco harvests or architectural plans. They were calculations of human profit. With his quill pen, Jefferson scribbled the numbers that would haunt American history. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. Those words weren't merely the musings of one slaveholder. They represented the cold mathematical foundation of America's most horrifying industry. An industry that transformed human reproduction into calculated enterprise. An industry that would generate billions in wealth while condemning generations to systematic dehumanization. By 1860, this system would force over 1 million enslaved people from Virginia and Maryland into the Deep South through operations so brutal, so calculated, that they turned human bodies into the nation's most valuable commodity. More valuable than gold, more valuable than land, more valuable than anything America produced. This is the story of America's slave-breeding farms, and it's worse than you ever imagined. The winter of 1808 changed everything. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa, slaveholders across Virginia and Maryland faced a crisis. The expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South demanded fresh labor, but the supply had been cut off. For most, this would have spelled disaster. But for the calculating minds of the Upper South, it spelled opportunity. Robert Lumpkin stood in the courtyard of his jail in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom district, watching as construction workers topped his 12-foot walls with iron spikes. The year was 1844, and Lumpkin had just purchased 3 lots on Wall Street for $6,000. He wasn't building a prison for criminals. He was building America's most notorious human breeding facility. The Devil's Half-Acre, they called it. And the devil himself would have been impressed by what happened inside those walls. The compound stretched across an entire city block, just 3 blocks from Virginia's state capital. 4 separate buildings housed different horrors. Lumpkin's residence, a guest house for clients, a kitchen and bar for entertaining, and the centerpiece, a 2-story brick slave pen, 40 feet long, designed to hold men, women, and children who would become the raw material for America's breeding industry. But what made Lumpkin's operation uniquely terrifying wasn't just the scale, it was the methodology. Inside those walls, enslaved people were forced into sexual encounters while wearing hoods. Hoods that prevented them from recognizing their partners. Partners who might be family members, brothers, sisters, cousins. The anonymity wasn't mercy. It was calculated cruelty designed to prevent family bonds that might interfere with business. Stockmen, enslaved males, specifically selected and rented for breeding purposes, were rotated between facilities. Their only purpose was reproduction. Their only value was their ability to father children who would become property from the moment of birth. The numbers were staggering. By the 1850s, Richmond alone was exporting between 10,000 and 20,000 enslaved people monthly. And Lumpkin's operation was just one of dozens in the city. But to understand how America built this industry of human horror, we must travel back to a mansion on a Virginia mountaintop where the intellectual architect of American freedom was busy calculating the profits of human misery. Thomas Jefferson's 4% solution wasn't cocaine like Sherlock Holmes. It was something far more insidious. In 1792, while serving as Secretary of State, Jefferson made a calculation that would reshape American slavery forever. Sitting in his study, reviewing Monticello's accounts, Jefferson realized something that had escaped his notice before. The enslaved population wasn't just maintaining itself, it was growing, and that growth represented pure profit. I allow nothing for losses by death, Jefferson scribbled in the margins of his letter to George Washington, but on the contrary, shall presently take credit 4% per annum for their increase over and above keeping up their numbers. 4% annual return from human reproduction, compounding annually. Jefferson wasn't just observing this phenomenon, he was pioneering it. His records show he encouraged the breeding of his enslaved population, understanding that female slaves and their future children represented the best means to increase the value of his holdings. The man who wrote that all men are created equal had discovered that enslaved women created the most reliable source of wealth in America. By the time Jefferson died in 1826, he had owned over 600 human beings. He freed exactly 10 of them, all from the same family, the Hemings family, which included the children he had fathered with Sally Hemings. The rest were sold at auction to pay his debts. Families torn apart to maintain the lifestyle of America's apostle of freedom. But Jefferson's calculations had spread throughout Virginia. Plantation owners across the state began implementing what they called breeding programs, systematic forced reproduction designed to maximize human output. The mechanics of these operations were documented with chilling precision. Sam and Louisa Everett, both born around 1850 near Norfolk, Virginia, provided Federal Writers Project interviewers in 1937 with the most detailed first-hand account of forced breeding ever recorded. They had been enslaved on Big Jim McLean's plantation, which housed over 100 people. In 1937, 90-year-old Louisa recalled the traumatic beginning of their relationship when McLean forced them to consummate their marriage in his presence. Marseille Jim called me and Sam to him and ordered Sam to pull off his shirt, Louisa testified, her voice still carrying the pain of events 8 decades past. And he said to me, "Nor, do you think you can stand this big nigger?" He had that old bullwhip flung across his shoulder. So I just said, "Yeah, sure, I guess so," and tried to hide my face so I couldn't see Sam's nakedness, but he made me look at him anyhow. McLean didn't stop there. He forced them to perform sexual acts in his presence, treating their reproduction like livestock breeding. When Sam and Louisa produced what McLean called fine big babies, he began forcing them to perform at parties where enslaved people were made to have orgies for the entertainment of white guests. This wasn't aberrant behavior. This was business. Charles Ball, born in Calvert County, Maryland, around 1781, witnessed slave markets where breeding wenches were explicitly advertised and sold at premium prices. In his 1837 narrative, Ball described a buyer examining pregnant women like livestock. Our master replied that these were 2 of the best breeding wenches in all Maryland, that one was 22 and the other only 19, that the first was already the mother of 7 children and the other of 4. Such wenches would be cheap at $1,000 each. $1,000 in 1837. That's over $30,000 today, for a human being valued solely for her reproductive capacity. The financial infrastructure that supported this industry was as sophisticated as anything on Wall Street. Baltimore Life Insurance Company dominated Virginia's slave insurance market, writing nearly 60% of its policies between 1854 and 1860 on enslaved people. They charged double the premium rates of white lives because, as their actuarial tables noted, enslaved people faced extraordinary hazards from overwork, inadequate medical care, and violence. Banks created slave-backed securities that were sold to global investors. Thomas Affleck's Cotton Plantation Record and Account Book, published in 1847, provided standardized methods for calculating slave asset appreciation and breeding profitability. These weren't small-time operations. They were industrial-scale enterprises with sophisticated financial instruments. The numbers reveal the scope. By 1860, the total value of American slaves reached $4 billion. $4 billion. That exceeded the combined value of all gold, silver, and currency in circulation. It exceeded the value of the South's total farmland. It was more wealth concentrated in human chattel than America had ever seen concentrated in anything. Franklin and Armfield, operating from 1828 to 1836, epitomized the industry's reach. Based in Alexandria, Virginia, they became the largest slave trading firm in American history, selling over 25,000 people. Their 3-story compound took up half a city block, complete with pens for male and female captives, kitchens, stables, a hospital, and a tailor shop where enslaved women made clothing for captives being shipped south. Their business model was simple. Purchase enslaved people at low prices in Virginia and Maryland, ship them to Louisiana and Mississippi, and sell them at massive markup to cotton plantation owners. In a single year, they generated over $100,000 in profits, equivalent to millions today. Isaac Franklin bragged that his company sold more enslaved people in Natchez than all other slave traders combined. A visitor in 1835 estimated Franklin and Armfield sold 2/3 of all enslaved people brought to the city in the previous decade. But perhaps no location embodied the calculated horror of slave breeding more than Maryland's Eastern Shore, where families like the Tubmans lived in constant fear of separation. Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad routes specifically targeted Maryland's breeding operations, helping families escape before they could be torn apart. Her own family had been devastated by the industry. Her sisters sold south when she was still a child. Her marriage to John Tubman complicated by the constant threat that their children would be valuable property. The demographic patterns reveal the scope of Maryland's operations. In selling states like Maryland, women outnumbered men by 300 per thousand, creating optimal conditions for reproductive exploitation. These weren't accidents of nature. They were deliberate manipulations of human populations to maximize breeding potential. Elizabeth Keckley, born in 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, experienced the intergenerational nature of breeding trauma. Her mother, Agnes, had been raped by Master Armistead Burwell, making Keckley the product of forced breeding. Beginning when Keckley was 20, Alexander Kirkland repeatedly raped her for 4 years, resulting in her son George's birth in 1841. In her 1868 memoir, she wrote, "He persecuted me for 4 years, and I became a mother. The child of which he was the father was the only child that I ever brought into the world." One sentence capturing generations of trauma. One sentence revealing how breeding operations destroyed not just individual lives, but the very concept of family, love, and human dignity. The legal framework that enabled this industry was embedded in Virginia's earliest slave codes. The 1662 law of partus sequitur ventrum established that children followed their mother's enslaved status. This legal doctrine meant every pregnancy in slavery was guaranteed profit for the owner. The 1705 Virginia Slave Code expanded these protections, creating economic incentives for maximizing enslaved women's reproduction while removing any legal barriers to forced breeding. When the federal government banned the international slave trade in 1808, these laws became the foundation of a protected domestic market worth billions. Virginia's legislators understood exactly what they had created. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, speaking to the Virginia legislature during the winter of 1831 to 1832, boldly asserted, "The exportation has averaged 8,500 for the last 20 years. It's a practice, and an increasing practice, in parts of Virginia to rear slaves for market. How can an honorable mind, a patriot, and a lover of his country bear to see this ancient dominion converted into one grand menagerie, where men are to be reared for market like oxen for the shambles? 8,500 people per year, from Virginia alone, treated like livestock, bought and sold based on their breeding potential." Henry Berry of Jefferson County estimated the annual exports at not less than 10,000. Thomas Marshall of Fauquier, son of Chief Justice John Marshall, reported that Virginia had a slave population of nearly 500,000, whose value is chiefly dependent on Southern demand. Translation: Virginia had become America's human breeding ground. The state that produced George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had transformed itself into a factory for producing enslaved people. The resistance to this system was as remarkable as it was dangerous. Enslaved women developed sophisticated strategies to combat forced reproduction despite facing death for their defiance. Medical resistance became their primary weapon. Enslaved communities maintained extensive knowledge of contraceptive herbs and abortifacient plants. They used sage tea and cotton root to induce menstruation, practiced extended breastfeeding as natural contraception, and preserved traditional African medical knowledge despite severe punishment risks. The Great Dismal Swamp, spanning Virginia and North Carolina, became one of America's largest maroon colonies, housing thousands of escaped slaves over 3 centuries. These communities provided sustainable alternatives to plantation life, developing agricultural settlements, economic networks, and armed resistance capabilities that successfully repelled militia attacks for generations. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800 and Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 both targeted breeding centers and slave markets. Turner's revolt killed 55 to 65 white people and prompted Virginia legislative debates about ending slavery. These rebellions demonstrated how breeding operations concentration created both vulnerability and opportunity for organized resistance. But individual resistance was perhaps most remarkable. Women like Jenny, enslaved by Virginia's B. Talbert, navigated impossible circumstances with extraordinary agency. In 1792, Talbert promised to emancipate Jenny and her 6th child if she bore him 5 children. She fulfilled this agreement in 1803, negotiating her freedom and her child's through the very system designed to enslave them forever. The psychological warfare employed by breeding operations extended far beyond physical violence. The architecture of places like Lumpkin's jail was designed to break the human spirit as systematically as the body. Anthony Burns, a Virginia slave who escaped to Boston in 1854, was returned to Richmond under the Fugitive Slave Act and held at Lumpkin's jail for 4 months. According to Charles Emery Stevens's 1856 account, Burns was confined in a room only 6 or 8 feet square, in the upper story of the jail, which was accessible only through a trap door. Burns was allowed neither bed nor air. A rude bench fastened against the wall and the coarse blanket were the only means of repose. He suffered torture by overly tight irons that held his arms behind his back, ground into his wrists, and caused his feet to swell. He couldn't remove his clothes or properly relieve himself. Once a day, he received cornbread and a small amount of meat without utensils, and drank from a pail of water, refreshed once or twice a week. This wasn't punishment for a crime. This was treatment designed to break the will of someone whose only offense was seeking freedom. The psychological impact of constant family separation was perhaps even more devastating. Enslaved people lived with the knowledge that any pregnancy might result in children who would be sold away. Any relationship might be severed by economic calculation. Any expression of love became a vulnerability that could be exploited for profit. Frederick Douglass captured this psychological torture. The slave mother can only be expected to resist the cruel separation of herself and her child, so long as such resistance is practicable. At the same time, the argument would seem to be good that, where slavery exists at all, the slave mother who does not cry aloud against it and use every endeavor to defeat it lacks the maternal instinct. Enslaved mothers were trapped between the natural desire to protect their children and the knowledge that showing too much affection made those children more valuable as breeding stock. The transformation of Mary Lumpkin's story reveals both the system's cruelty and the remarkable resilience of those who survived it. Mary was a light-skinned enslaved woman who bore at least 5 children fathered by Robert Lumpkin at his notorious jail facility. When Lumpkin died in 1866, he willed all his property to Mary, making a formerly enslaved woman the legal owner of one of America's most infamous slave jails. Rather than profit from the facility's dark history, Mary chose transformation. In 1867, she leased the property to Nathaniel Culver, a Baptist minister dedicated to educating newly freed African Americans. Culver established the Richmond Theological School for freedmen on the site. The school became one of the first educational institutions for African Americans in the South. The transformation was symbolic. The devil's half-acre became God's half-acre. The site where human beings had been reduced to breeding stock became a place where human dignity was restored through education and opportunity. The school eventually evolved into Virginia Union University, which continues to serve as a historically black institution. Mary's decision to transform the site of her trauma into a beacon of education represents perhaps the most powerful act of resistance in American history. The scope of trauma inflicted by slave breeding operations continues to reverberate through American society today. Dr. Joy DeGruy's research on post-traumatic slave syndrome documents a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery. Breeding practices created specific trauma patterns that persist across generations. Adaptive behaviors, where mothers downplayed children's abilities to protect them from being sold, family disruption impacts, causing attachment disorders, and hypervigilance patterns stemming from breeding farm conditions where appearing lazy resulted in violent punishment. Contemporary scientific research demonstrates that trauma can be encoded in DNA and transmitted across generations, with 14 generations of impact documented in some studies. The health disparities affecting African American communities today directly reflect this historical exploitation. African American maternal mortality rates are 3.5 times higher than white women. Healthcare mistrust stems from breeding-era medical abuse. Persistent medical racism causes black patients to receive less pain medication due to false beliefs about pain tolerance, beliefs rooted in slavery-era medical experimentation. J. Marion Sims, known as the father of gynecology, performed over 30 experimental surgeries on individual enslaved women without anesthesia to develop techniques later used on white patients. Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, the names of women subjected to repeated experimental procedures, represent how breeding operations extended beyond reproduction into systematic medical exploitation. These patterns of medical racism established during the breeding era continue affecting healthcare delivery today, contributing to contemporary health disparities that reflect not individual choices, but the persistent impact of systematic exploitation. The economic dimensions of slave breeding created wealth patterns that still influence American society. Richmond's export of 10,000 to 20,000 enslaved people monthly at peak operations generated enormous capital that funded infrastructure development, banking systems, and industrial expansion throughout the South and North. The insurance companies that developed slave-specific policies, the banks that created slave-backed securities, the shipping companies that transported human cargo, all of these industries accumulated wealth that was passed down through generations of families who never directly owned slaves, but benefited from the breeding industry's profits. Meanwhile, the communities targeted by these operations lost not just individual family members, but entire generations of potential wealth accumulation. The children who should have grown up to build businesses, acquire land, and pass wealth to their descendants were instead sold as commodities, their economic potential extracted to benefit others. This transfer of wealth from black communities to white institutions created economic disparities that compound over generations through what economists call the wealth gap multiplier effect, the absence of generational one. Wealth in communities affected by slave breeding continues to influence homeownership rates, business formation, educational opportunities, and economic mobility today. Contemporary efforts to address these historical injustices remain inadequate to the scale of trauma and economic damage inflicted by slave breeding operations. Princeton Theological Seminary's commitment of $27 million represents the largest reparations program by any educational institution, while Virginia Theological Seminary established a $1.7 million fund for descendants of enslaved people on campus. But these efforts pale in comparison to the wealth generated through breeding operations. Economic historians estimate that slave breeding contributed over $50 billion in today's currency to American economic development between 1810 and 1860. The compound interest on that wealth, accumulated over generations, represents trillions in contemporary value. Legislative initiatives in Virginia and Maryland have studied reparations possibilities, though federal bills remain unpassed. The Virginia the Slave Breeding State We Demand Reparations Now petition specifically calls for recognition of breeding as uniquely traumatic, arguing it caused distinct generational impacts, requiring targeted remediation. Archaeological investigations of known breeding farm sites could provide additional evidence of these operations' scope. Genetic studies of descendant communities might document epigenetic trauma transmission. Oral history projects preserving resistance narratives and legal research into reparations frameworks specific to breeding practices represent crucial steps for addressing this historical injustice. The slave breeding industry in Virginia and Maryland represented American capitalism at its most dehumanizing, treating human reproduction as manufactured commodity while generating enormous wealth that funded national economic phallus development. The system's sophistication, from financial instruments and insurance policies to standardized accounting practices and depreciation schedules, influenced modern business methods while inflicting trauma that continues affecting African American communities today. The courage of individuals like Sam and Louisa Everett, Harriet Tubman, Mary Lumpkin, and countless unnamed others who resisted, survived, and preserved their humanity, despite systematic dehumanization, represents remarkable resilience that deserves recognition and reparations. Understanding this history remains essential for comprehending how slavery's economic foundations created lasting inequities and why contemporary disparities in health, wealth, and social outcomes reflect not individual failings, but the persistent impacts of systematic exploitation designed to treat human beings as breeding stock for profit. On winter evenings in Richmond today, tourists walk through the rebuilt streets of Shockoe Bottom, unaware that beneath the pavement lie the foundations of Lumpkin's jail. The site where human beings were reduced to breeding stock now hosts parking lots and Interstate 95. But the stories of those who suffered and resisted in those spaces live on. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry forward not just the trauma of what was done to their ancestors, but also the strength of those who refuse to be broken by America's most calculated system of dehumanization. The echoes of that resistance remind us that human dignity cannot be commodified, human love cannot be regulated, and human spirit cannot be bought or sold, no matter how sophisticated the system designed to exploit it. In the end, it was not the slaveholders who proved the strength of their system, but the enslaved who proved the indestructible nature of human resilience. That may be the most important truth about America's slave-breeding farms. They failed not because they weren't profitable, but because they could never fully destroy what they sought to exploit. The unbreakable human spirit that transforms even places of horror into possibilities for hope.